days. This is the longest day of the year. Ashley loves it when I remind her of that. Because that means from now on, they're going to be getting shorter every day until December 21st. So, but this is the longest day of the year. So enjoy it, because this is the most sunshine you're going to get all year long. You love that, right, babe? And I owe the men in this congregation an apology for not telling you Happy Father's Day on Sunday. Not growing up with my dad, it is a little easier for me to remember Mother's Day than it is for me to remember Father's Day. But you should not have gotten snubbed. We have a lot of good men who are good fathers in this church, and those who've experienced that know what a blessing that is. So I'm sorry that I snubbed you Sunday on your day, but you deserve to be recognized too. We finished up Hebrews 11 on Sunday. Today's Wednesday, right? So Sunday. Was there anything else we need to talk about on those last couple verses? The main point of those last couple verses is just that all of those that have been mentioned throughout the text of Hebrews 11 did not experience the fullness of the reward that they were seeking after, because it remained for them to be perfected with us, that is, on this side of the cross. And so perfection comes through Christ, and it comes through Christ whether you're Abel all the way back at the beginning, or Abraham or Moses or Rahab or Sarah or anybody else. Perfection comes through Christ, and so they had to wait for the reward, and had to be made perfect in the same way that we are. Chapter 12, of course, begins with a passage that you've heard preached 100,000 times. You've heard me reference it a number of times. I need to silence this little. I hope my phone's not over there, is it? Good. So it can go off and it won't bother us. Great passage talking about the fact that we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses that's just been mentioned. And we know, based on what Hebrews 11 says, we have a lot of those people that are named. There are a lot of others that are kind of just referenced generically. And you and I know of people who have gone on before us who are a part of that great cloud of witnesses that are waiting for us to come join them. People who have been faithful to the Lord, not only in biblical times, but in our own lifetime, that we appreciate their example and what they stood for. They also are a part of this great cloud of witnesses. And so, because we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, we're told in verse 1 to do what? A couple things we're told to do. Some in the negative sense, some in the positive.
With endurance.
Okay, one of the things that he mentions is this idea of running with endurance. What does that phrase bring to mind? Running with endurance. Because I do think, again, I'm a big advocate for the fact that the Holy Spirit does not choose words carelessly. Run with endurance the race that is set before you. What does that remind us? What are those words? What does that phrase help us to understand?
It's not a sprint.
It's not a sprint.
Short. It's going to be a marathon. You're going to have to last.
I think it's important.
Continue.
I think it's important that we recognize that there's a difference between a sprint, that's a really fast race that you're going to pour all your energy into and just dump it all at the very beginning, and you don't have to worry about it lasting. This is an endurance race. We are running a longer race, a marathon, Chuck said. I've never run a marathon in my life. I have no interest in running a marathon. it's never been something that interested me. It's never something I really wanted to work toward. So I don't know what that's like, other than people that I know who have run marathons before. I've watched the coverage of the marathon on the Olympics, and before you judge me, they do not sit there and watch them run 26.25 miles. They keep coming back to it from other events. So, but the point is, I've seen people who have gone through that. I've known of people who've run that, and I know of the amount of willpower and conditioning that it takes to endure a race of that length. That's what the Hebrew writer is telling us. That's what the Holy Spirit's telling us this Christian race is. It's not something that we're just going to get up from the watery grave of baptism and immediately jump into, and we just got to sprint as hard as we can because it'll be over really fast. That may happen on rare occasions for some people. I think about Ken's sister, who was baptized only a few weeks before she died. She has no less reward than anybody else because of the fact that her Christianity, the length of her being a Christian, was short. But for her, it was kind of a sprint. It didn't last very long. But for most of us, it's an endurance race. And so it's not a matter of us getting up one morning and making a decision and that's it. That's all we got to do. It is a continual choosing to continue on this race and to be what God wants us to be and to seek the strength that He provides. And that's a couple of the other things that are mentioned in this particular passage is what? What are some other things we're supposed to do? And then there's more that comes on later in this text, but what are some things we're supposed to do? As I said, some of it negative, some of it positive. Joy's got something for us. She had her hand up.
I don't know if this qualifies for positive or negative. The ESV says, lay aside every weight.
Okay.
The version that I'm most familiar with says, lay aside every hindrance.
Okay.
Which I like.
So lay aside every hindrance, lay aside every weight. When we think about the idea of weights being used for training for a runner, or I think about a baseball player when they get up in the batters or the what is it, warm-up circle to kind of get their swing going, they usually have weights on the bat. But then when they get to when they're on deck, they're using the weights. When they actually get up to the plate, the weights are gone. Those things that might slow you down or might hinder you, were to lay those aside. And then he goes on to say, and the sin which clings so closely. I think those two things are different. Sin is obviously in every instance what? It's negative. It's something we want to avoid, right? We don't, a little bit of sin's not okay. So we never want to be involved in sin. But this idea of the weight or those things that hinder us, may not necessarily be something that's sinful, right? I mean, we can get busy in life with a whole lot of things that aren't sinful. But can they hinder our walk with the Lord and our running this endurance race? Can we get too busy? Sure we can. And so sometimes we have to set aside things that may not be sinful in and of themselves, but they're things that hinder us or keep us from our focus on running the race that's set before us. So I think those two are different. And I think it's important to make the distinction. And then he goes on to say what? Run with endurance the race that's set before us. And then perhaps the most important part of this entire admonition. Fixing your eyes on Jesus. Keeping your eyes on the goal. Keeping your eye on the prize. Because why is that important? I mean, it's not just in Christianity, by the way. It's important in basically every aspect of life, right? Why?
Well, one thing, Jesus is in heaven. That's where we want to go.
That's true.
We also look at what he did for us, and you look at him on the cross and see what he's done for us. So that should motivate us to continue on.
That should motivate us and keep us going. All of those things are good reasons to look to Jesus. What else?
It's also kind of like in Matthew 14 when Peter steps out of the boat and, his gaze averts from Jesus, and that's when he got scared. And, I recently was at a birth, and, the mom, when she was panicking, she would find my eyes, and that is kind of where her strength was.
Focus.
Like, yeah. And so, when she would avert her eyes, like, she would panic and lose control. But, that's kind of how we are with Jesus. If we lose sight of him, then we panic and sink.
Well, yeah, think about it. I don't know how many of you've run marathons. It's irrelevant, though. I think we can relate to this illustration. If you're running a marathon, 26 and a quarter miles, I think that's right, isn't it? 26 and a quarter is the distance? I think that's right. And we're going to say that's right unless somebody says it's not. 26 and a quarter miles. What if at mile 9, you look at it and you think, oh, it's only mile 9, and you just get fixated on it. It's only mile 9. What's going to happen? You're going to have a real hard time finishing because you've lost your focus. You've forgotten what the goal is, and you've gotten fixated on this mile that's not even at the halfway point, and you're already tired. Your energy feels like it's going. Again, I don't know firsthand, but I know runners talk about getting a second and third wind, which is the idea of they essentially have to push through fatigue, and then they kind of get another burst of energy. But one of the ways that they do that is that they keep their eyes fixed on what the prize is, what the goal is, what the finish line is. They may think about the smaller steps on the way, but the finish line is always the thing that keeps bringing them back. That is always their focus. It's always their motivation. And as Chuck said, Jesus is at the finish line. He's already run the race for us. He has gone to great lengths to secure this finish for us, and he is there in heaven. And so we keep our eyes fixed on that goal of being with him when this life is over with. And so we've got this great cloud of witnesses, all these wonderful people who've gone on before us that we long to be reunited with. And I do think it's interesting, going back to the Old Testament again, especially the book of Genesis, one of the phrases that's repeated frequently in the book of Genesis for the patriarchs when they died was, anybody remember? I know I'm asking unfair things. He was, some of the translations say, gathered to his people, right? So it's this idea of a reunion that's taking place, and we long for that reunion. But more than anything else, more than anybody else that we want to see when this life is over with, the one that we ought to want to see the most is Jesus. The one who secured this wonderful prize for us and has gone through so much. And so we keep our eyes focused on him, and it helps us to endure. It helps us to endure because that's where we long to be. The same way if you were on a long journey, business trip or whatever by yourself, and your family was at home, you keep your eyes fixed on them because that's where you want to be. You want to be back home so you can be with the people that you love. We keep our eyes fixed on Jesus from that perspective. And then he goes on in verses 3 and 4 to talk about some of the other stuff Chuck was talking about, mentioning a moment ago. And that is, you look at what Jesus has gone through for us. What is true of what we've had to endure? It pales in comparison to what Jesus went through, right? And I don't know about you, but this happens to me frequently in life, that I will look at people and the suffering that they've endured, and I will catch myself complaining about something ultimately that is bothering me, and I'll think, who am I to complain when they're having to endure that? Well, the Hebrew writer wants us to keep our focus on Jesus, because no matter what you've gone through and no matter what the reason is that you've gone through it, nothing you've ever gone through is anywhere near what he went through. And so he reminds them, consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. And then he says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. He's writing a letter to these Christians. Are they dead? He's writing a letter to them. Are they dead? No, they're not dead. So have you gotten to the point that your suffering's as bad as Jesus was? And even if we look at just other aspects of it, and frequently, when I suffer in my life, what's the cause? Myself. It's okay, you can say it. It's not going to hurt my feelings. It's true. It's me. Jesus, when he suffered in life, was it ever because of something he did? That did wrong. It might have been because of things that he did, but it was because other people were mistreating him in spite of the fact that he was righteous, completely righteous. So, Jesus endured all those things that he suffered throughout his life and ministry, and ultimately, obviously, through his death and crucifixion. And so, just to put it simply, what do we have to complain about? Really, what do we have to complain about? And I'm not saying it because, we should just stop complaining. We're going to complain. But the point is, when we find ourselves struggling with these things, this is a key passage for us to get us back on track and to keep us going. Just like the marathon runner who at mile 9 or mile 12 or mile 13 may look at it and say, I don't know how I'm ever going to get through this. If they focus on that, they're not. But they instead get their mind back focused on the goal of where they want to be and what they're striving for. And it helps them to keep pushing through the pain and the difficulty and the fatigue and moving on toward the goal. We can do the same thing. And so passages like this, you've heard me say 100 times, maybe 1,000. When you don't feel the things that you want to feel, or in some cases the things that you think you should be able to feel as a child of God, peace and security and hope and all those success and triumph and all of those things that ought to be ours because we're Christians. When you don't feel those things, it's okay to feel your feelings, but you should also at those times remind yourself of truths that you know to be true, because those truths will help to push us forward and to keep us focused. The pain doesn't immediately go away. That's not the point. But it does become bearable when we keep our eyes focused on Christ and on all that he has done for us and on what the scriptures reveal for us. So we can use that, those truths to help to push us through the times when we're just not feeling it. Because those times have come and they will come again. And it's okay that they come. Because it gets us focused again, and maybe sometimes that's just exactly what we need. Yes, ma'am. Joy.
I was thinking about the marathon idea, and you gave another reason. I think that reminding ourselves of these truths and that God set up routine worship times for us, the communion on a regular basis, those are ways. They're like little signs that are saying, keep going, keep going.
Yeah. Well, they are. And think about it. What frequently happens to people when they get down and when they're in pain and when they're suffering with regard to their assembling? What frequently happens? They want to isolate and retreat. Now, we're not talking about people who just physically can't get here. And we have a lot of those. We're talking about people who could be here, who don't. And we know that we've got a lot of people who are here and they really probably shouldn't be. It took them a great deal of effort to get here. But why do you think they're here? Based on knowing them the way that you know them, why were they here even when they probably really didn't feel like it? Because they know that what God says we're supposed to do is good for us. And so they did it anyway. And yeah, it took a great deal of effort, and it probably hurt, and it might not have been comfortable sitting here, but there were benefits that were to be gained by it. And guess what else they did in the meantime? They encouraged all of us. Because it reminds us, you think you've got it rough. Brother or sister so-and-so, you know how much pain they're in. You know what they're enduring. And yet they were out. Stop belly aching. and so, I mean, it really does. It's another one of those things that just helps to get us up and moving again at times when we get down. And we all do it. And so it's helpful to us to see those examples too, and to be reminded of the example of Jesus before us too. Dan.
Well, you got to start in verse 2. You look at the thing that comes before, saying he's the finisher, the person at the end of the race.
Yes.
He's the one who actually put on the race. There wouldn't be a race if it
There wouldn't
wasn't
be a
for him.
race.
So, I mean, he's the one who initiated it. You know, we wouldn't even have even thought of, we would be completely shut out
Right.
of any chance of
Wouldn't be a reason to run.
seeing him at the finish line if he hadn't put the race on to begin with.
No,
If he
that's
hadn't
right.
started everything. So he's the originator or the starter or, what's it say here, the author.
He's the author and finisher. He started it and ended it. He gave us the starting place and the ending place. And so we push forward because we long to be with him and because of what he went through for us and all of those truths. Okay, then we've got this section beginning in verse 5, which quotes from the Old Testament again and deals with this concept of discipline. I want to pause before we get into talking about discipline itself too much and really think about this particular passage in the light of the context overall of this book. Because what is the point of bringing this up here in Hebrews 12, verses 5 through about verse 11? I mean, let's think about this first off. Why are we typically disciplined? Because we did something wrong. Okay. And we've overall in this book been focusing on the fact that these Christians are suffering. Why? Because they're doing the right thing. And there are peoples, primarily in this instance, Jews, who are bent on the law of Moses continuing one way or the other, who are persecuting them. So they're doing the right thing and being persecuted. So in the context of this section then, is that the central focus? Would it be the central focus based on what we know about discipline? Would it be the central focus that they're suffering persecution? I agree with Joy. Joy's shaking her head no. If I did that, you might hear rocks rattling around in my skull, but I couldn't hear anything when Joy was shaking. But I saw it, and so she said no. I agree with her. I don't think that's the focus in this particular passage. It has been in a lot of other areas of the text. But the idea that God would discipline them is, like I said, in the way that we understand it, typically discipline involves us being punished in some way for something we've done. They haven't done anything to deserve the persecution. But in the context of the book and overall in looking at the overarching position that they are suffering persecution, what have some of them done that seems to be the admonition of chapter 11, the beginning of chapter 12, and a reminder of why it's important to appreciate the discipline of the Lord. What have they done in light of that persecution? Some of them. We saw it at the end of chapter 10 too, also. Okay, some of them are giving in some of these areas. If they're not giving up completely on Christ, they're trying to make compromises where God is not going to permit a compromise. And so perhaps that is the focus of this particular section of this chapter and book. Because again, all that we know about discipline involves us being punished for something we're doing. And he even calls it that when he quotes from the passage in Proverbs. The Lord disciplines those whom he loves, and he does what? The English Standard Version uses a really firm word. Scourges, that's even firmer than the word the English Standard Version uses. Sorry, New American Standard gets the award. But the English Standard Version uses the word chastises. That's a pretty strong word, right? So this is something the Lord is doing or permitting because he loves them and they're not acting the way that they should. And so the Hebrew writer is reminding them of the need to be steadfast and to keep pushing. What is the danger that sometimes occurs? Maybe you haven't suffered this, but some of us have. What do we start? Oh, I don't know. I'm asking you to read my mind again. Scary, scary, scary. Okay, and that's the reality is that when we suffer in our lives, are we always clear as to whether it's discipline and chastisement or whether it's just a part of living here? Do we always know? I mean, sometimes I've done something really stupid or sinful, and then I'm pretty clear, right? I'm suffering because I did something that I shouldn't have done. That's easy. But it's not always clear what's going on. Job's friends thought it was because of his own wickedness. It wasn't true in Job's case. But nonetheless, even though Job knew that wasn't true, and even though he didn't deny God, he didn't deny that God existed, he didn't deny that God was there, what did his suffering lead him to say about God? And you can use whatever word you want. I'll use the word I've got in mind. And I think we do this too. Would it be fair to say Job felt like he was being treated unfairly? That God was allowing him to suffer unfairly? I think it's fair to say that. And I think, I know I felt that way before. Maybe you have. And the reality is that when we get to feeling like that, sometimes we feel like God just has it out for us and that God doesn't really care about us the way that he said he did or the way that we feel like he should. And so sometimes when we suffer different things, sometimes it's no fault of our own. Persecution these Christians were suffering. Sometimes it is our fault. No matter what the cause of suffering is, what should be our response to it? Okay, rejoicing in your trials or suffering. I mean, there's some sense in which that is at least implied within this text. Because let's talk about discipline now. What is true of discipline? How do we feel about it? It hurts.
Well, it strengthens you.
Okay. But to start out with, I think it's safe to say and fair to say, it hurts. We don't like it. We didn't like it when we were kids. We don't like it when we're adults. Discipline is not pleasant. It's kind of the point of it, isn't it? I mean, wasn't that the point of getting spankings or
And though-
whatever it was you suffered when you were growing up? Is that it wasn't supposed to be pleasant? If it was pleasant, did that really dissuade you from doing the behavior? No. So that's it's intentionally meant to be painful, difficult. Yes.
You need to discipline yourself.
Yes.
And again, it's not fun. Just like I like to go to the gym and people look at me and say, that's not
crazy man.
fun. You put yourself through pain, but
Right.
you know what? It helps me grow and get stronger.
Right.
And in anything we do to discipline ourselves, we need to remove ourselves from maybe something we enjoy. It's going to make you better.
If you've been through surgery, what is generally speaking the hardest part of having surgery? Is it the pain after it? Generally speaking, what is it? Well, the third day, yeah, and it usually is the pain then. But the hardest part of it generally, thinking about poor Jim getting his knee replaced. He's been in pain, and the pain stinks. It's awful, right? But what's going to be the hardest part is the getting back up and regaining your strength, right? That doesn't just snap back. It takes time. Is it painful to regain your strength after surgery? Yeah, it is. It hurts. If it doesn't hurt physically, it hurts emotionally, and it hurts our pride because we think we ought to be able to do this, and we can't because it exhausts us. And so you have to regain that strength. Same thing's true in the gym. We use pain ultimately to make us stronger. And they need to be reminded of the fact that whether the suffering is their persecution or whether the suffering is the chastisement of God, what is the intention ultimately? What is the point of it all in the end? The pain? Make it harder? God likes to watch us suffer. That's what it is. No, it's to make us stronger. And we see that happens in all these other areas. It happens in the spiritual realm too. It happens in our spirituality and all of those things. So God knows that. And so when we do something that's wrong, there's some sense in which God's built in natural consequences that occur because of sins that are committed. Sometimes God may be actively causing us difficulty because He wants to wake us up. And when we see that suffering and that difficulty and that discipline or whatever it is that is the cause of our suffering, and it leads us to look negatively on God, it's leading us in the wrong direction. And so we've got to keep our focus on Jesus. We've got to remember this passage that God, He allows those to suffer and He disciplines those whom He what? This passage says. The ones He loves. That's why a parent disciplines their child. I know they don't believe it growing up. They think we just like torture. But the reality is discipline is given by parents to try to help children to understand where the boundaries are, what's right and what's wrong, and to see the benefit of doing what they ought to do and the negative side of doing things they shouldn't do. Because as you know, I said as a parent for years, right now it's a spanking or a grounding. They get out there and they break the law, what is it? Maybe jail or prison time. They're lucky. I mean, what happens a lot of times when people break the law? They get seriously injured, hospitalized, or even die. So, I mean, the consequences get steeper all the time. And in the spiritual realm, if we don't follow God, if we don't choose to submit ourselves to Him, what's the consequence? You know, the worst consequence ever is spiritual death. And so the consequences just get bigger and bigger. The stakes are higher. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to put a side note into what you were saying about, does God just, like to be mean? And I mean, of course He doesn't, but we shouldn't just assume that everyone knows that, because there are some parents that are cruel.
Yes.
They need a reminder, like this, to say, God is not like your earthly father or,
Right.
earthly mother. He's
And that
not
is a good
cruel.
point. That is a good point. Generally speaking, and I do think this statement in Hebrews 12 is a generality. Generally speaking, I think it would be true of all the parents here. How do we discipline our children? As what? According to this passage. I mean, we claim we're disciplining them in the instruction that God's given us, and certainly that's our aim. But is it always clear how God wants us to discipline our children and when it's really important? No. So how do we discipline? Every parent does it. As seems best to us, right? We want what's best for our children, but what's the problem with our judgment about what seems best to us? It is, at its very best, flawed, right? Because it's ours, and we are people, and we sin. And so our discipline is not always perfectly administered. It's not always consistently administered the way that it should be. But what is true of God's discipline? And again, I think this can be true in some sense, whether you're talking about what God is actively bringing, or back to Job, what God just allows to happen. I think it is always true that God does. How does He do that? How does He administer the discipline or permit whatever He permits? It is always what?
For our good.
It's always right place, right time, right timing, right amount, all of it's true. He always does it perfectly, which, by the way, is something else we should remind ourselves when we suffer, is that God always disciplines righteously. So if God is permitting you to suffer something, what does He know to be true? And I do firmly believe 1 Corinthians 10:13, that God does not allow us to suffer more than what we are able to endure, absolutely holds true in every single facet of our lives. Is it saying that God will never give you more than you can handle, to go back to Wilson's lesson? No, not by yourself. Will God ever allow you to suffer more than you can handle with His help? No. And that's the point. One of the points of suffering is for me to remember. I mean, look at Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He had the thorn in the flesh. He pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it'd be taken away. And what did the Lord say? My grace is sufficient. For it is in your weakness that my strength is most perfectly shown. So we are reminded in the midst of suffering that ultimately, yes, we have to be able to get up on our own 2 feet, and we have to push forward, and we have to keep going and keep doing. But if we think we can do that, and that we're going to be strong enough or smart enough to figure it all out on our own, what's going to happen? We're going to fall. But with God's help, I mean, was Job suffering more than he could handle? By himself. Absolutely. It was more than anybody could ever handle by themselves. But did he make it through with God's help? Yes. Stronger, better, faster. I know, $6 million man. But 80s kid. But he was stronger and better because of it. And then God ultimately, in the end of the book, blesses him greatly in what he has physically. And of course, he looked forward to his reward. Susan.
So I think it's also important to remember that, a lot of people who have things happen in their lives, and they always say, well, I can't believe that God allowed that.
Right.
And my response to them sometimes has been, well, have you ever thought that it wasn't something that God allowed, it's something that Satan has put in your life to take you away from the Lord?
Right.
And so we just have to be aware of how powerful Satan can be and that he's out there using things to draw us away from the Lord. So, it's just important to remember that as well.
Yeah, and I mean, people that really typically have nothing to do with the Lord, and then they suffer something like that, and they immediately want to blame the Lord. I mean, one of the things to think about is, did it get you looking to the Lord? I mean, here you are. I mean, even if it's to blame Him, what has it at least got you doing? Acknowledging that He's there. Guess what? This Lord that you're blaming for what it is that you're suffering is the one who wants to help you through all of it and provide the peace and the security and the eternal home that He's been longing to give you since the moment you were conceived. So He's there, and he even if he was the source of what it is that you're suffering, He does not intend harm with it. He intends it ultimately to be for your strength and for your good. So we need to remember the benefits that come from it, or can come from it, if we will look to the right person. Anything else about this section on discipline? I just wanted to point out that discipline is usually something we think of as being the result of our own actions. We've been focusing throughout this book on the fact that they were suffering persecution because of their faithfulness to Christ, but that must not be the focus in this section, is the only point I wanted to make about that. I still think understanding the principle behind this, that the Lord loves us and that the Lord intends good out of it, is true no matter what the source of suffering is. Even when we suffer for our own sins, I mean, ultimately God wants us to do what in the middle of our sin and suffering? He wants us to wake up and look to Him and come to Him. Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to go ahead and say that whether it is a result of our own sin or not, someone else doesn't necessarily know that.
No, that's true.
So, to use the phrase, you made your bed, now you have to lie in it, is out of line.
There are lots of things that are out of line. Some of them are, I mean, just like what we were talking about a moment ago, the Lord will never give you more than you can handle. While that may be true, that He will never give you more than you can handle with His help, is it helpful in the midst of somebody's horrible suffering? No, it's not helpful at all. There are lots of things that we say because they're true, and we think, well, just because they're true, it's going to help somebody. And the reality is, it's just not helpful. It may be, all things are lawful, but not all things edify. There may be a lot of things that are true that are not necessarily helpful at the time. And so being reminded of that and thinking about that, it can be helpful to us too. We've got to be careful about the things that we say. Just because they're true doesn't mean they're going to help. Yes, sir.
Let's not lose sight of one of the points made here of discipline is also a sign of authority and ownership. It says that, as a father with 4 children, I didn't go up down the neighborhood disciplining
All the kids.
other kids.
You didn't do that?
Even though I probably could have taught them a thing or few. I never did that because they're not my children.
Probably.
But to that point, discipline is not just punishment. Discipline is when people look at me and say, you remind me of Bill Walker. It's not just my appearance, but it's my manners and my character and the things that I do,
Right.
where that is a stamp. God places His stamp on His children, not other people's kids.
Right.
And so discipline is also the way you learn to mow the yard, the way you learn to 100 other things that you learned or didn't learn or learned well or had to relearn. The way that your family, your parents, your father puts their mark on you is discipline that also is part of how we are seen by the world and how we are seen of one another. I mean, discipline's not just correction. It's where we get the word disciple.
Yes.
That's a follower, you know?
Right.
And so kids are going to, by their nature, adapt to the environment they're raised in. And that stamp or that discipline is on them, whether good, bad, or otherwise. And that's what he says about our earthly parents. You know, some of the things they disciplined into us were
Right.
really not for our good,
Right.
but they thought maybe that was the right thing to do, or it's what they learned. And so there's a whole aspect to this idea of discipline that's about the mark of God upon each one of us and what that means to our salvation. We won't be recognized as one of his kids if we haven't been disciplined by him.
Right. How many times growing up did you say, well, I'm not going to do that with my kids when I get grown up? And then how many times did you eat those words when you became a parent yourself? You will become your parents. I mean, because as Greg said, their mark is on you. And so that is true in our physical families, but certainly we want it to be true of our spiritual walk too, that God's mark is on us, and not simply because of the fact that we're disciplined by him, but because of the fact that we have been trained by the discipline in a way that makes us more like our Father, because that's ultimately part of the goal. So we'll pick up there in talking about some of these miscellaneous admonitions that continue in verse 12 and following. And maybe we'll get through chapter 12 on Sunday. I kind of doubt it, but we'll get as far as we can.